Hey guys, tonight we start somewhere impossible. Somewhere ancient sailors believed the world simply stopped. The ocean turned to mist, the stars dropped lower, and the horizon faded into a blank, white silence. You're on a creaking wooden boat now, maybe Phoenician, maybe Greek, and the wind's no help. There's no compass, just the hope that you don't fall off the edge of everything. Welcome to the westernmost edges of the ancient world, where paradise wasn't in the heavens or some abstract future reward. It was just out there, beyond Spain, beyond Morocco, hiding behind the ocean fog. This is where paradise used to be thought to be. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from a real-life edge-of-the-world location, drop your city and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're sailing toward the Isles of the Blessed, sometimes called the Fortunate Isles, sometimes just called that place where only the good get to go. These mythical islands popped up in Greek mythology, but they weren't floating in the clouds. They were placed firmly in the far reaches of the Atlantic Ocean. People like Hesiod and Pindar wrote about them with surprising specifics. Mild climate, no snow, plenty of crops, and not a single HOA in sight. Some even said the gods rewarded heroes by letting them retire there. Immortality optional, hammocks mandatory. Now, keep in mind, this was long before Google Earth. To the Greeks and Phoenicians, west meant mystery. After the Strait of Gibraltar, known back then as the Pillars of Heracles, the world just became rumor. Monsters, whirlpools, upside-down clouds. But there were also tales of paradise, fertile land, gentle breezes, eternal spring. Enough olives and wine to turn even the grumpiest philosopher into a relaxed beach bum. Some believed the isles lay off the coast of Africa, near the Canary Islands. Others thought they were closer to the Azores, or just straight up floating somewhere they'd never get to. And maybe that was the point. The paradise had to stay just out of reach. Like your dream job that requires 15 years of experience in something that's only existed for 5. You can almost feel it, the way they must have stared at the sea, hoping the next storm would wash them ashore on one of those islands. Or maybe not hoping at all. Some accounts suggest these islands were only accessible to the dead, which means congrats. You've found heaven, but you're also not breathing anymore. Bit of a catch-22. But here's where it gets curious. The Isles of the Blessed weren't just religious metaphors. They were part of actual navigation. Some early Roman maps placed them as real places, worthy of a detour if your galley could survive the open ocean. And this wasn't limited to Greeks and Romans. Celtic myths from the British Isles also describe otherworld islands, like Avalon or Tir na Nog, places where time stands still and no one ages. You'd think that would cause some real identity crises after about 2 centuries of eternal youth. Scientists still argue about how seriously ancient cultures took these locations. Were they metaphorical after all? Were they just recycling sailor tales? Or did early explorers really spot volcanic islands like Madeira or the Canaries and imagine they'd found the doorway to bliss? One mainstream theory suggests that volcanic islands were the inspiration. Picture it. A lonely island rising out of the blue, steaming gently, full of strange birds and wildflowers. No taxes, no wars, no paperwork, just the slow rhythm of the waves. You'd call that paradise too. And there's a fringe tidbit for you. Some historians believe that these myths actually helped preserve ancient navigation routes. Sailors remembered where paradise was supposed to be and used those stories like breadcrumb trails. Not the worst way to remember your way home. Although, let's be honest, if your GPS ever told you to turn left at the Isles of the Blessed, you'd probably just cry and reboot it. Of course, some myths claim only the chosen few could find the islands. You had to be heroic, or noble, or maybe just lucky enough to get shipwrecked in the right direction. That exclusivity made it more alluring. Everyone else got fields to plow and goats to chase. The good ones got a beachfront hut and eternal naps. Even Plutarch took a stab at explaining Paradise's coordinates. He described islands with gentle rains and no sickness, suggesting they were located about 10,000 stadia from Africa, roughly where the Cape Verde Islands are today. Close enough to tempt you, far enough to drown trying. And don't forget the Atlanteans. Yep, some versions blur Atlantis and the Isles of the Blessed into one glorious concept. A divine land beyond the sea, lost after it became too proud or too advanced or too good at real estate development. You've heard it before. Man flies too close to the sun. Paradise burns down. Someone blames the gods, and suddenly you've got yourself a myth. It all comes back to that horizon. For thousands of years, people looked west and projected hope. They projected escape. The world behind them was tough. Droughts, taxes, wars, emperors who thought they were gods. But out there, you could believe in something soft, something untouched. That idea of paradise not in heaven, but just out of reach across the sea, is what carried these myths forward. And even now, when we know there's no hidden tropical archipelago at the edge of the Atlantic, some part of you still wants there to be. Just one little island where the phone doesn't work, the weather's always perfect, and no one asks if you've updated your resume. So you stay on the boat a little longer. You squint past the mist, and you hope. The boat drifts inland now, pulled by the slow breath of a river older than any empire. The sails hang loose, half asleep. Crocodiles blink from the reeds. Papyrus rustles. And if you look at the banks, really look, you'll see paradise. Or at least, what ancient Egyptians thought was paradise. You're on the Nile, gliding upstream. From the Nile Delta, north of Cairo, through endless floodplains, towards somewhere not on any tourist map. In Egyptian thought, the afterlife wasn't up in the clouds. It was up the river, a place called the Field of Reeds, Aru, in their language. And unlike our modern, hazy afterlife ideas, theirs was weirdly specific. You'd live in a mirror version of Egypt, only better. No landlords, no droughts, fewer snakes. Well, slightly fewer snakes. To get there, though, you had to die correctly. Ancient Egyptians were obsessive planners when it came to death. Tombs, scrolls, maps, backup scrolls. Honestly, they treated dying like a complicated visa process. First, your heart had to be weighed against a feather. Light heart equals sign paradise. Heavy heart equals sign soul-eating monster named Ammit. No pressure. If you passed the test, you didn't go to some abstract cloud kingdom. You went here, a place of eternal farming, ideal weather, and lots of beer. Literal beer. The gods were into it. The Field of Reeds had the best barley harvests you could imagine. You could fish forever, never break a sweat. and all your teeth grew back. And conveniently, you got to keep your job, but only if you liked it. For the record, if you didn't like your job, you could hire a little ushabti figurine to do it for you in the afterlife. That's peak retirement planning right there. Now here's the strange bit. This paradise wasn't far. It wasn't off in the cosmos or light years away. It was imagined just beyond the last cataract of the Nile, close enough that people buried in Thebes or Abydos thought they'd just have a short boat ride to the good place, like a ferry to eternal brunch. That proximity made death feel less scary and more bureaucratic. You just had to get the paperwork right. That's why tombs were stuffed with books of the dead, guidebooks for navigating the afterlife, complete with passwords, spells, and the divine equivalent of a boarding pass. Mainstream scholars agree that the geography of the Nile deeply shaped this vision. It was predictable, it was generous, and it ran in reverse from most rivers, south to north. That inversion fed into Egyptian myth. The source was mysterious, sacred, and full of promise. Where the river began, so did the soul's journey. Scientists still argue whether the field of reeds was ever associated with a real physical location. Maybe the wetlands of Upper Egypt, or perhaps the verdant borders of Nubia. But that tension between myth and map was part of the enchantment. Now, here's a delicious fringe theory for you. Some sorry researchers suggest that the Nile's seasonal flooding, which deposited rich silt and turned barren land green overnight, was paradise in action, a naturally recurring miracle. If you were a farmer scraping by in the desert, then watching your fields bloom once a year probably did feel like divine intervention. Why imagine heaven when you could just wait till spring? But let's not forget the aesthetics. In paintings and carvings, the field of reeds was gorgeous. Long grass swaying, rivers teeming with fish, gentle breezes fluttering linen robes. If Instagram had existed, paradise would have had a killer reel game. And the color palette? Think golds, blues, and deep emerald, plus the occasional oddly smug ibis. Even the gods loved the place. Osiris, god of the dead, ruled over it from a reed throne. He didn't hide in the sky. He hung out in a wetland. That's right, swampy immortality. You'd think eternity in a marsh would be miserable, but the Egyptians didn't see it that way. For them, life itself flowed from the Nile. Why wouldn't the afterlife follow the same path? And because Egypt was so stable, geographically and politically, for so long, this version of paradise stayed consistent for thousands of years. That's rare. Most cultures mutate their heavens like fashion trends. But Egypt stuck with the field of reeds from the Old Kingdom straight through Cleopatra. That's loyalty. Still, the dream had rules. If you were too greedy, too cruel, or just annoyed too many cats, your heart would betray you. The weighing ceremony was conducted by Anubis, jackal-headed and very punctual. If your heart tipped the scale, you didn't get a second chance. Ammit, part lion, part hippo, part crocodile, would swallow it whole, which is a strangely detailed way to say no paradise for you. But for those who passed, the reward was balance. That was the Egyptian ideal, not endless pleasure or divine status, just a better version of life, more stable, more fertile, less dusty. Paradise wasn't flashy. It was familiar. A world you already knew, just tuned to the right frequency. That might be the most elegant idea of heaven anyone's ever had. Not pearly gates, not halos. Just you, a boat, a fishing net, and a cool breeze rustling through reeds. So as your wooden boat pushes deeper up the Nile, you start to understand. Paradise wasn't something you escaped to. It was the best parts of what you already had, turned eternal. And if you lived with enough grace, fed the hungry, honored the gods, remembered your grandmother's name, you'd drift into that perfect river bend, cast your net, and never want to leave. Unless the mosquitoes were immortal too. Then, maybe rethink the Ushabti plan. Now the river vanishes behind you, and the breeze turns thin and cold. You're not sailing anymore, you're climbing. The air sharpens. Each breath feels earned. Snow crunches underfoot. Prayer flags flick in the wind. And around you rise the Himalayas, the literal rooftop of the world, where for centuries, people whispered that paradise lived above the clouds. This time, paradise wasn't a swamp or an island or a dream. It was a mountain, or rather, a secret valley hidden among mountains so remote you could only stumble into it by fate, accident, or divine favor. In Indian and Tibetan traditions, this was Mount Meru, a cosmic axis connecting earth to heaven. And around it, a garden so lush, so symmetrical, so profoundly correct that mere mortals couldn't stay for long without losing their grip on reality. You've probably heard of Shambhala, a mythical kingdom hidden somewhere in the Tibetan plateau. But this wasn't a fairy tale with talking animals. In early Buddhist and Hindu texts, Shambhala was real, like capital or real. A place of advanced wisdom, zero crime, perfect weather, and slightly smug enlightenment. Picture monks who meditate for 6 hours and still have time to invent algebra in the afternoon. In Hindu cosmology, Mount Meru was not just a mountain. It was the mountain. Everything rotated around it, literally. Stars, planets, the universe. Paradise wasn't beyond time. It was the center of it. And this axis mundi, this world pillar, wasn't placed randomly. Some claimed it matched the Pamir Mountains. Others said it was the Himalayas, cleverly disguised as regular peaks. Of course, scientists still argue whether Meru was ever based on an actual mountain. Some geographers speculate it may have drawn inspiration from Kailash, a remote peak in Tibet that's so sacred no one climbs it. Not because it's unclimbable, but because it's too sacred to step on. Even modern mountaineers respect the rule. That's rare. Now, if you're thinking, hidden mountain paradise sounds suspiciously like Shangri-La, you're not wrong. But you're also jumping ahead. Shangri-La is the 20th century remix, courtesy of British novelist James Hilton. He mashed together Tibetan ideas with some romantic adventuring and, voila, a paradise for exhausted colonialists. But long before the word was coined, the original idea of a valley of perfection existed deep in the Himalayan imagination. And the funny part? Most of the people who believed in it were already surrounded by jaw-dropping beauty. Snowy peaks, crystal lakes, temples carved into cliffs. But the idea was that somewhere even higher, maybe over just one more ridge, there was a land where everything was right. No disease, no war, no noisy tourists with trekking poles, just calm. This version of paradise had some spicy details. For instance, some Tibetan accounts claim Shambhala had invisible gates. You couldn't find it unless your karma was exactly tuned, like a radio dial. Other versions insist that paradise moves, like a slow drifting cloud city. Try putting that in your GPS. Rerouting, proceed to spin the prayer wheel, and try again. And here's a curious fringe detail. Some early Western theosophists, the kind who wore too much linen and named their cats after Sanskrit verbs, claimed Shambhala was underground. Not high in the mountains, but beneath them. A glowing, subterranean utopia, powered by ancient crystal tech and populated by very chill immortals who communicated telepathically. Like Elon Musk meets the Dalai Lama, with zero Wi-Fi. Whether above or below, the point remained. Paradise is hidden from the unready. This was a recurring theme in Himalayan thought. If you weren't spiritually aligned, or at least very polite, you simply wouldn't see it. Monks could walk right past the entrance 1,000 times and never notice. And if you forced your way in, legend says you'd either go blind, lose your memory, or suddenly remember your taxes were overdue. One mainstream theory suggests that these paradise myths served a political purpose. Ancient rulers used the idea of a hidden, righteous kingdom to bolster their own power. See, I'm enlightened enough to know where the real paradise is. Classic ruler flex. Others argue it was more psychological. In a world of hard lives and cold nights, people needed to believe there was something better, just out of reach, but not impossible. And the Himalayas helped sell the story. With peaks like Annapurna and Everest breaking through the sky, the sheer scale of the place makes you feel like heaven might be closer than you thought. Even today, tourists feel a weird pull toward this landscape. Call it spiritual. Call it altitude sickness. But the feeling that something sacred is just beyond the next bend, that's hard to shake. Scientists still debate whether these paradise myths had practical roots. Maybe they were coded migration maps. Maybe they encouraged exploration. Or maybe, just maybe, they were humanity's version of a sleep button. A way to dream a little longer, even when surrounded by snow, silence, and sore legs. But it's not all mystical fog. Even now, there are people, pilgrims, scholars, occasional YouTubers, who go looking for Shambhala, not with swords or compasses, but with open minds, hoping to catch a whisper of paradise in the wind. The idea refuses to die, and maybe it shouldn't. So you keep climbing. The air is thinner now. Your heartbeat is louder than your thoughts. But something up ahead catches your eye. Just a shimmer. A glint of something too perfect to be real. Maybe it's a mirage. Maybe it's hypothermia. Or maybe it's paradise, hiding behind one last ridge. You descend now, away from wind-blown peaks, and into a drier, dustier world. Flat land stretching between two slow, snaking rivers. It's hot. The air smells like cracked clay and distant rain. Somewhere, a goat brays with a weird amount of confidence. Welcome to Mesopotamia, where paradise wasn't hidden or high up. It was meant to be right here, behind the Garden Gate. You've heard of it. The Garden of Eden. Maybe the most famous paradise ever imagined. But strip away the stained glass imagery and Sunday school nostalgia, and you're left with a surprisingly geographical puzzle. Where exactly was it supposed to be? And why here, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq? Let's start with the basics. The book of Genesis describes Eden as a lush, well-watered garden planted by God, containing every kind of tree, pleasant to the sight and good for food. A place where lions were polite, snakes talked poorly, and clothing was optional until someone ate the wrong fruit. Classic vacation story. But here's the kicker. The Bible lists 4 rivers that flow from Eden: Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. and only two of those are real. The Tigris and Euphrates are hard to miss. The other two, not so much. Scientists still argue whether Pishon and Gihon were real rivers that have since dried up, metaphorical stand-ins, or just early editing errors. Fringe scholars have spent lifetimes trying to locate them. Spoiler alert, no consensus. Still, ancient theologians and geographers alike assumed Eden was a physical place. And for a long time, Mesopotamia, literally the land between rivers, was the front runner. It made sense. Early civilization began here. Crops thrived here. Cities like Uruk and Babylon rose here. If you were alive 5,000 years ago and wanted to describe the most life-giving place imaginable, you'd probably draw a map of the Fertile Crescent too. But here's where things get weird. Some traditions place Eden underneath something, beneath the earth, beneath a ziggurat, or even beneath Jerusalem, tucked under the Temple Mount like a divine basement garden. Others think Eden wasn't in Mesopotamia at all. It was in Armenia or Persia or even India, depending on who was drawing the map and how many wine jugs they'd emptied. One fringe theory suggests the Pishon River was actually the now dry Wadi Batin in Saudi Arabia, and that Eden was located in the Arabian Peninsula, beneath what's now desert. Imagine paradise buried under sand, slowly turning to dust, while camel herders unknowingly pitch tents on top of it. There's a joke in there about property values, but we'll be respectful. Another theory goes cosmic. Some scholars believe Eden wasn't on Earth at all, but in another realm entirely, a paradise dimension, if you will. Think of it as God's version of a gated community, accessible only through divine teleportation or extreme piety, which honestly is how most luxury resorts work anyway. And while we're at it, let's remember that Eden wasn't just a garden. It had rules. Specifically, don't eat from the tree of knowledge. But of course, someone always eats the thing they're not supposed to. And paradise is lost. Literally, banished, flipped off the map like a bad Yelp review. So why was paradise imagined as a garden at all? Because in Mesopotamia, gardens were powerful. They were walled, curated, irrigated. In a world of dust and heat, to control water was to control life. Kings built elaborate palace gardens, not just for beauty, but as proof of divine favor. If you could grow date palms and pomegranates in the middle of a desert, you clearly had some God-level skills. Eden, then, wasn't just any garden. It was the perfect version, the original, the prototype, and it wasn't public. It had a gate, a guard, a flaming sword because apparently subtlety wasn't invented yet. You couldn't just wander in. You had to be allowed. Mainstream scholars agree that Mesopotamian influence shaped the Eden myth. Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe gods dwelling in lush gardens. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions a magical land with gem-filled trees. Definitely not OSHA approved, but very scenic. There's a sense that paradise was always nearby, just behind the veil, waiting to be remembered. But here's the eerie part. Modern satellite imaging has shown ancient riverbeds, dry now, that used to flow across Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Some researchers think they match descriptions of Eden's lost rivers. Others say we're projecting myths onto mud. Either way, the land is still whispering secrets, even if we've paved most of it. And Eden, for all its sacred reputation, is oddly silent after Genesis. It doesn't get sequels, no updates, no expanded lore. It vanishes as soon as it's lost, which is maybe the most haunting part. You don't miss what you have. You miss what's just been taken away. So you stand now in the heat between invisible rivers, staring at cracked earth and wondering, was this once paradise? Or are we just looking for meaning in a place that gave birth to too many stories? Maybe that's what Eden was all along. Not a location, but a starting point. A memory of balance, of innocence, of a world before consequences. A garden that never quite goes away, no matter how many wars pass over it or how many towers rise from its soil. You brush the dust off your sleeves. A fig tree waves its leaves at you in the distance, but the gates are long closed. The sword still flickers in the sun, and the garden? Still waiting. Behind the garden, the heat changes again, but this time, it's different. Heavier, more final. You've left the rivers behind, and now you walk across cracked salt flats that reflect the sun like broken mirrors. Your sandals crunch on something that might have once been soil, or bones, or both. This is where the sun goes to sleep. Or at least, that's what people used to think. For ancient North African travelers, Berbers, Egyptians, later Arab cartographers, the western edges of the Sahara weren't just the end of familiar land. They were the very border of existence. And beyond them, the sea. But not just any sea. A golden sea, glowing at sunset, where it was whispered the sun itself would plunge each evening, hissing like a coin in water. And if you went far enough toward it, well, there was a chance you'd find paradise. Not the cloud-based kind, but an earthly heaven where the sun itself chose to rest. Think fewer angels, more long shadows and the smell of tamarisk trees. This paradise wasn't meant for the pure. It was meant for the brave. Because to find it, you had to walk into heat. North Africa, particularly the western Saharan fringe and the Maghreb, birthed some of the oldest myths about paradise as a place at the end of light. The sun moved westward, didn't it? So the place where it vanished must be special, and perhaps habitable, and perhaps even a little enchanted. Some versions called it the land of the sunset, a realm of gentle hills, perpetual orange light, cool winds, and people who spoke languages older than stone. Others spoke of mountains that drank the last rays of the day and were home to gods who slept during the night. Fringe myths described gold mines guarded by serpents the size of date palms, and pools where your reflection spoke back to you. You know, the usual Airbnb perks. And then came the travelers. Ibn Battuta, that restless Moroccan wanderer, spoke of far horizons and people with skin darkened by the sun's embrace. He may not have meant it metaphorically, but the phrase stuck. To the medieval Islamic mind, the furthest west was not just foreign, it was post-human. The world of spirits, of sleep. And if you made it through the heat alive, maybe, just maybe, you'd reach that hidden grove of olives where time didn't work like it used to. Of course, the Greeks had their say too. Remember those Isles of the Blessed from earlier? Yeah, they were probably thinking of the same spot. Herodotus, ever the speculative gossip, wrote about people who lived past the Atlas Mountains in perfect harmony. No war, no disease, no landlords. Their only problem was convincing the rest of the world they weren't a mirage. Modern scholars debate whether these myths were ever meant to be taken literally. Maybe they were metaphors for death. The sun sets, and so do we. Maybe they were political fictions to mark a spiritual border between the known and unknown. Or maybe And here's a mainstream theory. They were inspired by real oases, like Tafilalt or Ziz, where travelers really did find sudden green in a sea of dust. Picture it. You've been walking for days, hallucinating your own name, and suddenly there's water, shade, dates, laughter. Of course it feels like heaven, especially if your alternative is being turned into soup by the desert. Now, here's a delightfully odd detail. Some pre-Islamic Berber stories described paradise as an echo, a place where your voice spoke back to you, not with repetition, but with new answers. You'd ask, "Am I home?" And the echo would reply, "Almost." Trippy, right? But also kind of beautiful. The desert does weird things to your senses. You start seeing patterns in the sand, hearing whispers in the wind, convincing yourself that the rocks are watching. And when that happens, the idea of a hidden paradise glowing on the edge of the sun's path feels entirely reasonable. And let's not forget that even Islamic cosmology placed significance on the sun's movements. Some verses in the Quran describe Dhul Qarnayn, a semi-mythical king, traveling to where the sun sets in a muddy spring. Not the most Instagram-worthy location, but intriguing nonetheless. Paradise wasn't always glamorous. Sometimes it was just somewhere else. Fringe theorists, of course, had a field day. Some connected this sunset paradise with Atlantis, others with pre-Columbian knowledge of the Americas. One group insisted that the Sahara once held a lost green civilization, buried under sandstorms and bureaucracy. Scientists still argue whether the Sahara's climate shift, from savanna to desert, might have inspired myths of a once perfect land swallowed by heat. You can't shake the feeling that sunset paradise wasn't meant to be found, only imagined. It's too poetic, too luminous, too final. And yet people chased it. Caravans set out with enough supplies to survive weeks. Camels died. Maps lied. But still they went because humans are terminally hopeful. Maybe this time the gold sea would open. Maybe this time you'd step into the cooling dusk and find palm trees swaying in a breeze so sweet it makes you forget your name. You look west now. The light is slipping. The air holds its breath. Somewhere out there, the sun is curling up, dipping into something that isn't quite ocean and isn't quite sky. And you wonder, was this really paradise? Or was it just the end of the road? You're sailing again, but the ocean has changed. It rolls under your boat like it's thinking about something. Dark, slow, and deep. There's no land in sight. Only fog. The kind of fog that doesn't lift with the sun. Somewhere behind you are the coast of Iberia or Morocco. But ahead, the sea folds into itself like a secret. Welcome to the realm of the isles that shouldn't exist. To ancient Greek mariners, and later to Roman ones, the Atlantic Ocean wasn't just water. It was a living map full of moving pieces, floating lands, and disappearing islands that obeyed no laws of geography. The further west you went, the weirder things got. And in that weirdness grew myths of islands that shouldn't have been there, but absolutely were, at least until you tried to find them twice. One of the most persistent legends was that of Antilia, the Isle of Seven Cities. First recorded on medieval portolan charts, it was said to be a lush, habitable island where 7 bishops fled from Moorish invaders, each founding a city filled with riches, libraries, and unusually good civic planning. Some sailors claimed they'd seen it shimmering in the distance. Others landed, stayed the night, And then, just like that, it was gone. Cartographers kept drawing it anyway. Even Christopher Columbus had it marked on maps as a just in case. Nothing says trust your navigation like aiming for a ghost island based on hearsay and monk gossip. Another phantom was High Brazil, supposedly off the west coast of Ireland. It showed up on maps for centuries. Sailors swore it was real, visible only once every 7 years, covered in mist the rest of the time. Some claimed the island shimmered golden at sunset, while others said its inhabitants were tall, telepathic, and suspiciously well-dressed. You know, the kind of people who own matching cutlery. Mainstream historians believe these isles that shouldn't exist were optical illusions, mirages caused by strange atmospheric refraction over the sea. Ships might spot distant clouds shaped like land, or worse, Fata Morgana illusions, where entire coastlines seem to rise from nothing. But that explanation never sat right with everyone. Fringe believers, always ready to ruin your compass, insist these islands were real, just shy. Some suggested the lands floated, surfacing only when certain cosmic conditions aligned. Others claimed they weren't islands at all, but dimensional portals. If your ship got the angle right, you'd simply drift into another world, a paradise by invitation only. One of the oldest examples comes from Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus spends quality time getting lost at sea. Along the way, he hears about the Elysian fields, located at the ends of the earth, where heroes lived without pain, calmer than the Isles of the Blessed, warmer than Hades. Basically, retirement with perks. And of course, Pliny the Elder, the Roman fact vacuum, couldn't resist chiming in. He cataloged stories of floating islands and unreachable lands. The man would have believed a grapefruit had legs if you phrased it right. Now, here's a fun twist. Some researchers think these legends may have had a real foundation. Islands like the Azores, Madeira, or even the Canaries were discovered late by European powers, but probably known earlier through oral tradition or fluke voyages. Imagine a Galician fisherman blown off course by a storm, stumbling onto a volcanic paradise with blue forests and steaming pools. You'd come home and talk about a heaven island, too. Assuming you didn't get arrested for witchcraft first, even Islamic scholars contributed to the lore. Al-Idrisi, the 12th century cartographer, wrote of sea voyagers discovering strange islands west of Africa, including one where the inhabitants spoke no known language and worshipped the moon. Whether these were fabricated or misinterpreted local accounts is up for debate, but they fueled the same idea. Paradise lies just beyond the last reliable landmark. Scientists still argue whether these recurring island myths were wishful thinking or distorted memory. One mainstream idea: early sailors did find real islands, but couldn't navigate back properly due to limited instruments, currents, and celestial misreads. The ocean, after all, is very good at hiding things, especially when you're using the stars like a mood ring. But why did these paradise islands stick in the imagination so fiercely? Maybe it's because they gave hope to people on awful boats. Let's be honest, ancient seafaring was the worst. You were wet, sick, underfed, and praying your anchor wasn't made of rebar and curses. So if someone said, hey, 10 days west and you hit an island where everything is green and no one's stabbing each other, you packed an extra sail and went. And what if you did see land? Maybe it was a mirage. Maybe it was a weirdly symmetrical cloud. Or maybe And this is a theory you can't quite shake. Maybe it was real, just not meant for everyone. That's the defining trait of these islands: selectivity. They're not paradises you can conquer or colonize. They're paradises you stumble upon or don't. They flicker on the horizon, teasing you like a mirage you almost remember, like deja vu in saltwater form. So you scan the ocean now. No birds, no breeze, just a subtle shift in the light. Then, out of nowhere, a line on the horizon, a hill, a tree, something real. You blink, it's gone. Or maybe it was never there. The cold creeps in slowly this time. Not the playful cold of high mountains or breezy oceans, but the solemn kind that settles in your bones. You're heading north, way north, past the tree line, past logic, into lands where the pole star never sets and the sun sometimes forgets to rise at all. Welcome to a paradise made of ice. It might sound backwards now. After all, modern paradises come with palm trees and pina coladas. But for the ancient Norse, Siberians, and some Finnic peoples, paradise was not tropical. It was frozen, distant, and beautiful in its stillness. Let's start with the Norse. When they imagined the afterlife, they didn't always picture bloody halls or roaring fires. Not everyone went to Valhalla after all. The vast majority of souls, those who died without dramatic flair, were said to go to hell, ruled over by the goddess of the same name. But hell wasn't necessarily a punishment. In early Norse poems, it's described as cold, quiet, and peaceful. A realm beneath the earth, where snow falls softly and time folds in on itself. Not a bad retirement if you're into blankets and long naps. But the real intrigue lies in older, lesser-known Norse myths. Fragments suggesting the existence of Gleisis Vellir, or Shining Fields. This was a legendary land in the far north, where eternal youth awaited anyone lucky enough to reach it. In some versions, it lay near the mythical city of Odainsakar, the Deathless Acre. You couldn't die there, couldn't age, couldn't even get bored, apparently. That's a bold claim. Unlike Valhalla, which was earned through death and chaos, Gleisis Vellir seemed to reward the seeker, the one who ventured far enough into the frozen unknown. It wasn't up in the sky. It was under the same stars, just tucked away in the Arctic fog. Some scholars believe this cold paradise grew out of real northern geography. Places like Iceland, Greenland, and the Kola Peninsula have surreal landscapes, glaciers that glow blue from within, fjords that ring like glass, and forests that hum with silence. For people who lived in harsh climates, the idea of a slightly better frozen world, just a little warmer, just a little kinder, was an irresistible dream. Now, let's shuffle over to Siberia, where indigenous groups like the Yakuts, Chukchi, and Evenki had their own versions of a northern afterlife. Instead of fire and brimstone, they spoke of upper worlds, glimmering realms above the clouds, bathed in white light, where the dead were reborn into endless spring. These realms weren't necessarily hot, they just weren't lethal. Food grew on ice-resistant trees. Reindeer never got sick. Snow melted where you stepped, and then refroze in perfect patterns behind you. A particularly poetic belief among some Siberian shamans was that the aurora borealis, the northern lights, was the hem of paradise brushing against the world. That shimmer, that ripple in the sky, those were the souls of the blessed, dancing slowly just out of reach. Fringe theorists have, of course, tried to connect these beliefs with the idea of Hyperborea, a land beyond the north wind mentioned by the ancient Greeks. Hyperborea was described as a blissful land of eternal daylight, where people lived for 1,000 years and enjoyed perfect health. Odd, then, that the Greeks, who hated the cold, imagined their utopia somewhere frozen. Or maybe they just assumed if they couldn't handle snow, the gods must have built something better with it. Scientists still argue whether Hyperborea was ever meant to be a place or just an ideal. Some suggest the Greeks were echoing older Indo-European myths. Others think it was just poetic shorthand for somewhere we'll never conquer, so let's romanticize it. And yet, the cold paradise persisted. In medieval Christian lore, there were even whispers of a holy people living near the North Pole, guarded by magnetic forces, unreachable by sinful ships. One fringe theory claims that 17th century Jesuits believed the Arctic Circle held a secret Eden preserved in permafrost. It's like the Da Vinci Code, but colder and with more frostbite. What makes this all the more fascinating is that ice has memory. That's not metaphorical. Glaciologists will tell you that ancient snow holds traces of past climates, pollen, even volcanoes. So maybe it's no accident. People felt drawn to the ice as a keeper of eternity. If you want something preserved forever, bury it in a glacier. Or your freezer. But glaciers are more dramatic. Of course, there's one tiny problem with frozen paradise: surviving the trip. Even today, venturing into the Arctic is an ordeal. Back then, you needed layers, luck, and probably an emotional support elk. But that only added to the legend. If you did make it, what awaited was a world unspoiled by time. A place where the stars never moved and the snow whispered old stories. You step now into that hush. The ice glows blue. The sky pulses with green light. Nothing breathes, and yet the air feels alive. Maybe you're alone. Maybe you're being watched by something kind. Or maybe, just maybe, you've reached the place where the soul rests, not in fire or light, but in perfect cold. You've thawed now. Not just from the cold, but from the silence too. There's music again, carried by wind and bells. The ground under you is soft, fragrant. Trees blossom in impossible colors. Peaches so ripe they glow. Cranes glide above you with wings that don't flap. You're somewhere delicate, somewhere painted. Welcome to the East. You've just stepped into the floating, fragrant dreamscape of East Asian paradise legends. Places like Penglai, Horai, and the Islands of the Immortals, drifting forever on a lotus-scented wind. In ancient Chinese mythology, paradise wasn't high up in the sky or hidden in icy silence. It was offshore, always eastward. Across a mystical sea, beyond mortal reach, existed a realm called Penglai, one of the 3 or 5 blessed isles, depending on who you ask. It shimmered with golden pavilions, jeweled trees, and immortals who spent their time sipping elixirs, composing poetry, and presumably laughing at humanity's taxes. The earliest references to Penglai come from the Zhou dynasty, but the legend really crystallized during the Qin and Han dynasties. Even China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, famously sent fleets to find it, his hopes pinned on obtaining the elixir of eternal life. Unfortunately, none of his ships ever came back, probably because they realized eternal life wasn't worth a 2,000-mile sea trip with nothing but fermented rice cakes. Still, the stories persisted. These islands weren't just metaphysical. They were given coordinates, albeit vague ones. Sail due east into the morning sun, beyond the waves of silver and mist. And if you were righteous, wise, and not too nosy, you'd arrive. That's a running theme in East Asian paradises. You don't seek them, they allow you in. Japan had its own version. The island of Horai, or Mount Horai, appeared in classical texts and later Buddhist stories as a floating utopia. Sometimes it hovered above water. Sometimes it bobbed gently on waves. Either way, it was unreachable by normal ships. The trees bore fruit only for the enlightened. The breeze carried wisdom instead of pollen. And in some versions, time simply refused to move. You could live 1,000 years and never get gray hair. That's either paradise or a shampoo commercial. Mainstream scholars believe these stories were anchored, pun intended, in early seafaring fears. The East China Sea and Pacific waters were dangerous, unpredictable, and vast. To coastal dwellers, anything that disappeared over the horizon was immediately elevated to myth. And if a fisherman returned babbling about strange lands, well, maybe he'd found Penglai. Or maybe he just hit his head on an oar. Fringe theorists, of course, ran wild. Some believed the islands of the immortals were real continents: Japan, the Ryukyus, even California. Yes, that California. In one 16th century tale, a Chinese monk claimed a paradise existed far east of Japan, filled with white-skinned sages and golden mountains. He was either dreaming or very lost. Still, the myth traveled and morphed. Taoist philosophy layered in even more texture. In Taoist cosmology, these islands were alchemical spaces. You didn't sail there. You harmonized into them. They were realms of immortality through balance, not conquest. No one who sought paradise with a spear ever found it. But approach with stillness, patience, maybe a crane or two, and the islands might appear. Crane imagery is everywhere in these legends. Immortals often ride them. They circle the island's perimeter like sleepy guardians. Some tales say cranes can smell insincerity from a mile away. If you're spiritually off balance, they just keep flying and you'll never find land. Paradise isn't rejecting you. It's just not impressed. And then there are the peaches. In Chinese mythology, the peaches of immortality ripen only once every 3,000 years. Bite into one, and you become ageless, serene, a little smug. The orchard is said to grow on Kunlun Mountain, often described as the axis of heaven. In some versions, it's even connected to Penglai by celestial rope bridges, walkable only by those who have already forgotten all regrets. Good luck with that. Scientists still argue whether these island paradises were based on real archipelagos or not. Some point to the Zhoushan Islands, others to Taiwan, still others to the Kuril chain. But even the most grounded historians admit the stories were never really about geography. They were about possibility. That somewhere, far beyond our reach, was a place where nothing bad ever happened, and it looked suspiciously like a Chinese painting. And that visual consistency matters. In art and poetry, paradise was always depicted with certain signs: the crane, the peach, the immortal deer, the fragrant fog. If you saw those, even in a dream, you were getting close. Or maybe just reading too much Li Bai. What makes these Eastern paradises stand out is their tone. They're not dramatic. There are no flaming swords, no perilous journeys, no moral exams. Just silence, stillness, the sound of bamboo tapping in the wind, a boat drifting on pink water, a place where the point is not to win, but to stop needing to win. So you wait. You lie back in the boat. A crane drifts overhead. The the sea becomes glass. You think you see an island in the mist, but it doesn't matter. Because maybe, just maybe, that calm you feel was the point all along. The mist rolls over you again, but this time it's warm and thick. The air hums faintly, like someone whispering behind stone. You step forward and the ground gives way, not down, but in. There's no sunlight here, just a glow, gentle and golden, coming from somewhere below. Welcome to the forgotten paradise of the hollow earth. Yes, you heard that right. Not skyward, not across the sea, not even behind a magic waterfall. This time, paradise was imagined under your feet, deep inside the earth, in vast caverns lit by crystals, warmed by inner suns, and ruled by beings older, wiser, and definitely more chill than surface folk. This wasn't a fringe idea for some ancient cultures. To the ancient Greeks, there was Hades, of course, but in certain versions, its deepest levels weren't punishment zones. They were resting places for heroes and sages. The Elysian Fields, that final reward, sometimes sat beneath the world, not behind it, not fiery, not gloomy, just far from the noise. And the Celts? Their underworld, Annan, was anything but scary. It shimmered with music and feasting, ruled by a benevolent otherworld king. Travelers entered it through lakes, caves, or misty forest hollows. No death, no taxes, lots of fruit. And if you returned, your hair might be silver, your accent unplaceable. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and things start getting ambitious. By the 17th century, some scholars began to suggest that the earth was hollow, literally, with a sun at its core and whole civilizations living within. The most famous version came from Edmund Halley, yes, the comet guy, who proposed concentric spheres spinning inside the earth like some Russian doll universe. Each layer had its own magnetic field, its own sun, and surely its own cafe scene. Fringe? Absolutely. But the hollow earth theory stuck around. By the 19th century, it exploded in pulp fiction and traveler tales. Writers claimed entrances existed at the North and South Poles, disguised by fog or hidden behind ice walls. Some even argued that ancient paradises were inside, not outside, the known world. Paradise, according to them, wasn't lost. It just moved downstairs. One popular version described Agartho, an inner earth utopia ruled by high priests and powered by spiritual energy. Everything glowed slightly. The air smelled like eternity. Technology ran on harmony. People didn't age, and gossip was banned. It was like living inside a lava lamp designed by monks. Another variant, Shambhala, remember it from earlier, was sometimes relocated underground in Tibetan lore. Not on a mountaintop, not across the sea, but deep beneath the Himalayas, accessible only through winding tunnels and high-frequency chanting. Scientists still argue whether these beliefs were metaphorical, geographical, or just really committed metaphors for self-discovery. Because if you descend far enough into the earth, surely you find yourself. Or, at the very least, a warm rock. Modern readers might scoff, but let's be honest, the idea of an inner world, glowing and quiet, is deeply appealing, especially on days when the outer one feels like a poorly run game show. And ancient people weren't entirely wrong. The earth is layered. It hums. It shifts. And it holds secrets. Giant cave systems like Hang Son Doong in Vietnam can fit skyscrapers. Crystals grow in Mexican caverns taller than giraffes. There's a whole ecosystem below us. Microbial life, cave-adapted insects, blind salamanders. It's not glowing cities and peach trees, but it is something close to a quiet miracle. One quirky tidbit. In the 20th century, a few explorers claimed they had actually visited inner Earth paradises. A man named Admiral Richard Byrd allegedly flew into a polar opening in 1947 and met tall, telepathic beings who asked him, politely, to tell humanity to chill out. Was it real? Probably not. Was it popular? Oh yes. There are still online forums discussing the correct etiquette for visiting subterranean utopias. Bring your own light source. Don't interrupt the crystal harmonics. In some ways, the idea of paradise below us taps into a primal desire: shelter, safety, and stillness. A return to the womb, to the cave, to somewhere untouched by weather, war, or Wi-Fi. It's the same instinct that makes us build forts as kids, or want to hide under blankets when the world gets too loud. And unlike sky heavens or distant islands, this paradise feels physically possible. The ground is right there. You've stood on it, dug into it. If it really opened up, who's to say you wouldn't find something old and kind waiting below? So now, picture yourself descending, slowly, carefully, through limestone tunnels and echoing vaults. The temperature steadies. The air smells faintly of moss and metal. A soft glow filters in from walls you can't quite explain. And ahead, a city not built, but grown. Music like water. Trees that hum. Beings with patient eyes. You're not lost. You're not dreaming. You're just deep enough to leave the noise behind. And maybe, just maybe, the quiet means you've arrived. You've surfaced now. Out of the caves, through the fog, back onto dry land. But you're still searching. This time, you're not chasing whispers or visions. You're staring at maps, real ones, hand-drawn, gold-leafed, crusted with age. Monks and cartographers have gathered around, squinting at compasses and squabbling over longitudes like over-caffeinated trivia nerds. And right in the middle of it all, paradise. Or rather, where everyone thought paradise might be once. Welcome to the age of compass error, when paradise wasn't based on visions or holy texts alone, but on actual attempts to plot Eden with coordinates. Spoiler, it went poorly. For much of medieval Europe, paradise wasn't just a theological concept. It was a mappable location. The idea came straight from Genesis. Eden had 4 rivers, including 2 still known today, Tigris and Euphrates, which meant it had to be somewhere on Earth. And if it was on Earth, you could, at least in theory, find it. Cue a few centuries of deeply imaginative guessing. Let's start with the T and O maps used by early Christian cartographers. These weren't meant to be accurate, they were symbolic. The world was a circle, the O, divided by a T shape. Asia on top, Europe bottom left, Africa bottom right. At the very top, always Eden, a perfect circle of green, fenced off with angelic swords. You could see it, just not reach it, like that gated mansion you drive by on the way to the laundromat. And then came the real attempts. In the 13th century, Ranulph Higden placed Eden on a literal mountaintop in the Far East, somewhere near India. He believed the mountain was so tall, no human could reach it because it touched the moon. Charming, inconvenient, very much no public access. Later, Sir John Mandeville, the medieval travel blogger of his time, claimed he knew people who had actually seen Eden. He himself never made it, of course, but that didn't stop him from describing it in detail. Walls of fire, flaming swords, rivers that smelled like cinnamon. Scientists still argue whether Mandeville ever left his house. But here's the strange thing. These weren't marginal ideas. For a while, it was standard to treat Eden like a real lost place. Portuguese explorers searched the Indian Ocean. Jesuit missionaries debated whether it was on the Ethiopian plateau. Some Spanish priests were absolutely convinced Eden was in Sri Lanka, because apparently mangoes equal sign biblical proof. One fringe theory insisted paradise was on Mount Kilimanjaro, hidden just above the clouds. Another claimed it had drifted, literally moved, with the precession of the equinoxes, a sort of celestial lease transfer. One cartographer in the 1500s placed Eden near the North Pole, which, after Section 7, is quite the popular mystical zip code. What unified all these attempts was the idea that paradise had physical space. It wasn't up in the heavens. It wasn't metaphorical. It was on Earth, tucked away behind a volcano or mountain or linguistic misunderstanding. One mainstream theory. All these conflicting placements were the result of biblical literalism mixed with poor geography. Medieval scholars were trying to reconcile scripture with the physical world using incomplete knowledge. They had access to ancient texts, but not satellite images. They believed what they read, and then tried to prove it with compasses that didn't quite work. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, paradise was also detailed with startling precision. The Quran describes Jannah, the Islamic heaven, with flowing rivers, fragrant gardens, and endless comfort. While mostly considered spiritual, some traditions did try to place it on earth, or at least believe that its reflection or residue could be found in exceptionally beautiful locations. The idea of earthly paradises as echoes of the Divine One gained traction, particularly in Persian gardens, which were often designed to mirror paradise with fourfold layouts and central water channels. And just when you think paradise hunting couldn't get weirder, enter Jesuit missionaries in the Americas. Some of them genuinely believed they'd discovered Eden in the Amazon basin. The rivers were confusing. The forests were lush. The fruit was abundant. Never mind the jaguars or venomous insects. It was the vibe that mattered. Fringe theorists to this day insist Eden was somewhere in South America, hidden in a yet undiscovered valley. They point to similarities between biblical rivers and Amazon tributaries, forgetting that cartography is not a game of Pictionary. Still, you can't blame them for trying. Because really, what else could paradise be, if not a missing place you're sure is just off the map? Here's a fun twist. Some thinkers eventually gave up on paradise as lost and rebranded it as never here to begin with. Theologians started describing Eden as a state of being, not a location, like emotional Wi-Fi. You had it once. You lost the password. Good luck. But the maps didn't stop. Well into the Renaissance, artists were still painting Eden with precise botanical species, irrigation layouts, and climate annotations. Because if you can't find heaven, you might as well illustrate it convincingly. And now you're holding one of those maps. The ink has faded. The compass rose is off by 30 degrees. The rivers are drawn like spaghetti. But there it is, in the corner, a green circle, a note. Paradise, eastward, unknown. You smile. Maybe it's nonsense. Maybe it's a divine prank. But maybe, just maybe, you'll keep looking anyway. Now you're sweating. Not just warm, but jungle wet. The air clings. Your shirt might as well be soup. Cicadas scream like broken speakers. Every leaf is bigger than your head. This is no gentle garden or misty mountaintop. This is the Amazon, where paradise was so close European explorers swore they had found it, right before they were bitten, sunburnt, and profoundly humbled. Welcome to the tropical mirage, a paradise imagined so vividly it nearly cost hundreds of men their lives. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1500s. Spanish and Portuguese explorers are sailing down rivers they can't pronounce, fueled by cinnamon dreams and vague maps. Word spreads of a land to the west, deeper into the continent, where gold flows like water and life never ends. Some called it El Dorado. Others whispered about the land without evil, a Guarani legend of a peaceful, fertile region where no one aged, no one fought, and no one charged rent. And right in the heart of it all, the Amazon basin, vast, uncharted, and suspiciously green. To European minds, trained on the idea of paradise as garden-like, the Amazon looked perfect, lush, overgrown, full of fruits they couldn't name, and animals that looked halfway between dream and demon. Some priests reported trees that bled syrup, birds that spoke in sentences, and rivers so wide they seemed to swallow the sky. One chronicler declared he'd found a new Eden, overflowing with abundance. His proof? A monkey tried to steal his map. Mainstream scholars note that these accounts often over-romanticized what they saw. Indigenous communities had been shaping the land for centuries, building complex agroforestry systems, cultivating crops like cassava and cacao, and using slash-and-burn cycles with stunning precision. It wasn't a natural paradise. It was an engineered one, a living, breathing garden, built by civilizations the conquistadors refused to fully understand. But explorers weren't looking for nuance. They were looking for paradise. And so began one of history's weirdest travel frenzies. Dozens of expeditions plunged into the jungle, hoping to find eternal life, gold, or at least a place without royal taxes. Most found malaria, mosquitoes, and a sudden loss of optimism. Still, the myths grew. A priest named Friar Gaspar de Carvajal traveled with conquistador Francisco de Orellana down the Amazon in 1542. His journals told of women warriors, yes, the original Amazons, living in marble cities and guarding rivers of gold. The jungle, according to him, wasn't just wild, it was sacred. Scientists still argue whether Carvajal exaggerated to impress donors or genuinely witnessed something unusual. Either way, his words stuck. European imaginations lit up. If the old Eden was lost, maybe a new one had sprouted here, under thicker trees and steamier conditions. But here's the twist. The longer explorers stayed, the more their paradise melted into nightmare. Heat stroke, disease, rivers full of piranhas, bugs with opinions, and above all, the unsettling feeling that the land was not welcoming them. In fact, it might be actively mocking them. Some expedition reports read like slow, emotional breakdowns. We have run out of salt. Birds attacked at dawn. Luis has gone mad. He thinks the trees are whispering. Classic paradise behavior, and yet, people still believed. Fringe theorists today point to satellite imaging of the Amazon, revealing vast, geometric earthworks beneath the canopy. Could these be remnants of a forgotten utopia? Some say yes, that a massive, organized civilization once thrived here and was later erased by plague, drought, or cosmic rudeness. One quirky tidbit: a few 19th century naturalists genuinely believed the Amazon had healing properties, that its air cured lung disease, that its plants restored youth. Even today, wellness companies try to bottle that idea. jungle detox kits, rainforest serums, tree-scented teas with names like Inner Peace Root Awakening Elixir. We're not making that up. The thing is, paradise wasn't just in the forest. It was in the heads of those entering it. Jesuits described the Guarani's land without evil as an actual location, south, away from conflict, tucked between hills. For the Guarani themselves, it was both real and spiritual, a destination and a direction. When colonial violence escalated, they migrated en masse, seeking this better world. Some died in the search. Others simply never came back. Was it ever a place? Maybe not. But that didn't matter. Because the real power of the jungle paradise myth was that it made people move, try, escape. You don't launch an expedition for something you don't believe might exist, even just a little. So here you are, in the green hum. 1,000 frogs click in unison. Steam curls from leaves the size of bathtubs. Something rustles, but doesn't reveal itself. Is it paradise? A fever dream? Or just Earth, in one of its loudest moods? Whatever it is, it's not waiting to be discovered. It's already here. You just have to survive long enough to notice. Now you're drifting. Not walking, not climbing. Gliding, weightless on warm ocean air. The world has softened again. No jungle shrieks, no icy winds. Just waves, breeze, and the hush of paddles slicing through turquoise water. You're in the Pacific now, somewhere deep in Polynesia, where paradise wasn't a destination at all, but a direction, a pull of the soul toward the place where the sun rises. In many Polynesian and Micronesian traditions, paradise wasn't fixed. It wasn't on a map. It was eastward, always eastward, toward Hawaii, Pulotu, Avaiki, or any number of names passed down through chants and salt-soaked memory. It was where ancestors came from, and where the dead would return. To Western ears, that sounds poetic. To Polynesians, it was geography, spirituality, and identity all at once. These weren't abstract heavens. They were real lands, sometimes islands, sometimes realms beneath the sea, sometimes skybound, but always linked by water and blood. You sit now in a canoe, carved from breadfruit wood and stitched with coconut fiber. Beside you, a navigator stares at the horizon, not using a compass, but reading the stars, the swell patterns, the flight of birds. This was their GPS. Memorized star maps, passed from elder to apprentice over generations. And guess what? These techniques were so precise they could cross thousands of kilometers of open ocean without getting lost. Try doing that without Wi-Fi. Mainstream scholars agree that ancient Polynesians were among the greatest navigators in history. They reached almost every island in the Pacific. Hawaii, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, Aotearoa, New Zealand, long before Europeans showed up asking for coconuts and directions. But for many of these voyagers, the point wasn't just to settle. It was to reconnect with ancestors, with creation, with the East. In some traditions, the East wasn't just sunrise, it was rebirth, the direction your soul traveled after death, the way back to the original homeland. One legend tells of a double-hulled canoe sailing to Hawaii, not as a journey of discovery, but as a return, a homecoming. Of course, outsiders got excited. Early missionaries and colonial officers heard these stories and assumed Hawaii was a real island, lost like Atlantis or swallowed by the sea. Some even tried to match it to real land masses, Samoa, Tonga, or even Indonesia. But Polynesians never claimed it was that simple. Hawaii wasn't a place. It was a directional memory, a spiritual compass. And there's something beautiful about that. Most cultures build paradise as a fixed point, a garden, a mountain, a gated estate with good lighting. But here, paradise is where you're headed, not where you are. It's not on a pedestal. It's on the current, in the wind, in the push of the paddle. Fringe theorists, bless their sandals, have tried to map these traditions with wildly speculative models. One 20th-century author suggested Hawaii was in South America, and Polynesians had originally come from the Andes. Because why not throw llamas into the mix? Others claimed ancient mariners followed a secret ley line grid of energy across the Pacific. Look, if your boat makes it across 2,000 miles of open water, you've earned the right to make wild claims. But what's even more interesting is how these paradise concepts shifted over time. As colonization fractured Polynesian societies and forced Christianity into the cultural fabric, Hawaii began to blend with heaven. It became both afterlife and origin, a space between worlds. Some Christian converts even described Jesus returning from the east, not from heaven, but from the sea. The old stories didn't disappear. They just adjusted their sails. One mainstream debate still lingers. Was Hawaii ever a real ancient homeland? Some linguists think so, citing shared root words across vast distances. Others say it doesn't matter. The function of Hawaii wasn't to be found. It was to be remembered. And you feel that now, don't you? As your canoe cuts across the glowing water. There's nothing out here but sea, sky, and story. And yet, you're being pulled. Not by a place, not even by hope, but by a memory you never personally had, passed down through wind and whisper. You pass coral atolls shaped like smiles. Islands so low, they look like clouds sitting on the water. Palms wave lazily. Children fish from canoes without speaking. There's a rhythm here, a kind of calm that doesn't need explanation. And in that stillness, you hear it, a chant carried by breeze. It's not in a language you understand, but it feels like home anyway. Maybe Hawaii is there, just past the sunrise. Or maybe it's in the motion of your boat. Maybe paradise is the direction, not the destination. So you keep paddling east, because that's where the ancestors went. And one day, so will you. Your paddle slows. The waters are still warm, the breeze still soft. But something feels different now. You're no longer sailing toward a whispered dream or a mythic sunrise. You're docking at a real island with real people, real hammocks, and brochures printed in 5 languages. Welcome to colonial paradise, a place dreamed up not by poets or prophets, but by advertising departments. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European empires had gone full throttle global. The sun never set on their borders, and neither did the hunger for tropical perfection. Suddenly, paradise wasn't for the dead or the divine. It was a vacation destination, or worse, a business plan. Tropical islands in the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, places like Mauritius, Tahiti, Barbados, Java, were sold to Europeans as the New Eden. Palm trees? Check. Fruit falling into your lap? Check. People with exotic customs who somehow smiled just when the camera clicked? Check. Paintings, books, and travelogues exploded with scenes of untouched beaches, happy natives, and sunset rituals carefully described by men who spent most of their visit under mosquito nets, sweating and writing in cursive. One painter's Paradise was another man's dysentery. The irony? These were the very same lands that were being extracted, colonized, and reshaped. The image of paradise relied on a convenient blindness, a refusal to acknowledge the forced labor, land theft, and cultural erasure happening just out of frame. Mainstream historians now refer to this as the paradise paradox. The more a place was described as Edenic, the more likely it was being exploited behind the scenes. Colonial governments would fund illustrated books praising the gentle beauty of island life, all while sugar plantations nearby ran on enslaved labor. One British travel writer called the West Indies a heaven on earth, except for the unfortunate smell of boiling cane. You can almost feel the cognitive dissonance in his teacup. And here's where it gets even more absurd. Entire paradise aesthetics were invented during this time. European authors started to expect certain visuals: crystal lagoons, grass skirts, carefree drummers. Locals were often asked to perform paradise for visitors. Hula in Hawaii, once outlawed, then rebranded for tourists. Fijian firewalking, spiritual ritual, remarketed as dinner theater. Fringe theorists, meanwhile, saw the same landscapes and declared them evidence of Atlantis, Lemuria, or extraterrestrial influence. One 19th century spiritualist was convinced that Tahiti was the last remnant of a divine pre-flood civilization. He also thought pineapples had mystical geometry, so grain of salt. The core problem was this: colonizers needed paradise to be both real and controllable, something you could visit, own, and ideally monetize. They didn't want actual mystery. They wanted postcards. This led to the rise of paradise industries, where entire economies were shaped around the promise of escape. Luxury hotels, sugar barons, pearl divers, brochures with illustrations of bronze-skinned women holding fruit plates that no one asked them to carry. But paradise can't be mass-produced. The more it's branded, the less it breathes. Locals were often pushed out of ancestral lands to make way for villas. Sacred groves became golf courses. Languages were banned. Dress codes imposed. Suddenly, paradise came with a dress code and a check-in time. And yet, amid all this distortion, fragments of older paradise stories survived. In Tonga, stories of a floating ancestral homeland. In the Maldives, oral tales of isles that vanished in moonlight. In Haiti, voodoo cosmologies blending Christian heaven with African spirit worlds. Paradise reasserted itself quietly underneath the noise because stories know how to wait. Scientists still argue how the paradise brand shaped the physical landscape. Did colonial fantasies influence how infrastructure was developed? Answer: yes. Did imported plants and animals wreck indigenous ecosystems? All to make places look more garden-like. Also, yes. Paradise, when forced, tends to become a monoculture. And the thing is, this version of paradise, crafted, packaged, sold, never really satisfied. Victorian tourists wrote poems about feeling hollow in their hotel rooms. Wealthy colonial wives wrote letters home, describing all the beauty in the world and none of the peace. Because even in a paradise brochure, you still brought yourself. And if yourself was anxious, lonely, or colonizing a continent, the hibiscus flowers weren't going to fix it. One surprisingly honest entry from a 19th century travel diary reads, "I arrived at the famed island of love. The coconuts were plentiful. My soul remains confused." So you step off the steamer now. watching the waves roll onto sand imported to look whiter. The palms sway, planted in perfect rows. The music playing by the beach bar was chosen for your benefit. And somewhere, just past the hotel fence, a woman hangs laundry and hums a tune from her grandmother's childhood, one the tourists never hear. You were promised paradise. You got a catalog. But the real version might still be here, quiet, unbranded, waiting for those who stopped trying to buy it. Now the brochures are gone. The steamers sailed off. The drone of tourism fades behind you, and you're left standing on firm, factual ground, surrounded by data, altitude readings, carbon levels, seismic charts. Because at some point, people stopped dreaming paradise and started measuring it. Welcome to the moment when science got involved, and as always, gently ruined everything. By the 20th century, satellite imaging, aerial photography, deep-sea exploration, and geological surveys had thoroughly demystified the world. Every island had been mapped, every river traced, every mountain tagged with coordinates and contour lines. There was no blank space left to hide a floating utopia. And so, paradise stopped being a place and started becoming an idea. Let's start with the geologists. As it turns out, most of those lost paradises that explorers had raved about, those hidden islands, vanishing mountains, rumored cities of gold, were sitting on tectonic fault lines, erosion zones, or floodplains. The Garden of Eden, likely wiped out by a massive shift in river systems in Mesopotamia. Atlantis, possibly inspired by the eruption of Thera, modern-day Santorini, around 1600 BCE. Turns out paradise sinks. Mainstream scholars began reframing paradise myths as natural memory, oral traditions passed down to explain real geological events. A tsunami becomes the wrath of the gods. A volcanic eruption becomes divine punishment. And a lush valley swallowed by shifting climate becomes a lost heaven. Romantic? Yes. Accurate? Debatable. Linguists and anthropologists jumped in too. They found that many cultures' versions of paradise had linguistic roots tied to ideas of home, balance, origin, or rest, which meant that what we've been calling heaven for thousands of years might just be a cultural way of saying, I miss how things used to be. But not everyone was on board with this demystification. Fringe theorists fought back. If paradise wasn't here, then maybe it was off-world. Some claimed Eden was an alien biosphere. That Shambhala was a dimension accessed through magnetic fields. That the original garden floated aboard a space station operated by very polite extraterrestrials with a love for floral arrangements. You know, standard academic stuff. Meanwhile, theologians adapted. They began to speak of paradise less as a destination, more as a metaphor for inner peace, spiritual fulfillment, moral balance. Eden became the moment before we wanted more. The field of reeds became the quiet your soul longs for. The Isles of the Blessed, whatever place in your mind you go when things finally stop hurting. It was beautiful in its own way, but the maps went blank again. And for some people, that felt like a loss. There's something comforting about thinking paradise is real, isn't there? That if you just take the right turn, climb the right hill, survive the right storm, you'll find it. The idea that it could be proven false by a geologist with a clipboard, that felt like a kind of theft. Still, scientists kept digging. Quite literally, they found that the Amazon, long thought to be untouched wilderness, was in fact heavily managed, engineered over centuries by indigenous peoples using soil-building techniques that bordered on magical. Paradise wasn't natural, it was intentional. And in a way, that brought the magic back. Maybe paradise wasn't some place the gods planted and left. Maybe it was something people built, over generations, in rhythm with the land. One quirky fact: in the 1970s, NASA ran psychological tests to determine what kinds of images best calmed stressed astronauts. The overwhelming winner? Not white sand beaches, not waterfalls. Green hills with scattered trees and gentle light, aka the exact kind of landscapes we evolved in. Paradise might just be our own memory of safety. And now, with the planet changing faster than ever, the idea of paradise has shifted again. Scientists now use the word paradise when talking about lost ecosystems, extinct species, or fragile climates. The phrase "we're losing paradise" shows up in documentaries, in climate reports, in anxious headlines. Paradise is no longer distant. It's disappearing. But maybe it's not gone. Maybe it's just changing shape. Today, paradise could be a coral reef slowly healing, a forest growing back after fire, a child breathing clean air in a city that used to choke. Paradise isn't untouched. It's recovered. It's possible. It's earned. And even now, scientists still argue over what exactly paradise is: a neurological state, a social construct, a myth with utility. The only consensus seems to be it matters. Because even if it's not a mountain, a map, or a literal garden with angel security, it's still something people need, something to hope for, to walk toward, to believe in, even as we measure it out of existence. So now, you set down the data sheets, the charts, the old maps. You look out over a quiet patch of earth, imperfect maybe, but alive. And in that moment you think, maybe paradise doesn't need to be proven. Maybe it just needs to be protected. You're standing on a cliff now, wind in your face. The last rays of sunlight wash over the landscape like a curtain call. Behind you lie all the places we've wandered: deserts, rivers, islands, caves, maps. Each one a possibility, each one a memory. This is the end of the journey, or maybe it's the beginning. You gaze out over the sea, the jungle, the horizon. All of it blurs together. Every version of paradise, from ancient myth to colonial fantasy, from icy heavens to fiery gardens, collapses into a single question: why do we keep needing it? Somewhere deep down, we know. Paradise is a story we tell ourselves, not just about where we go when we die, but where we wish we could live while we're still breathing. It's a mirror held up to our desires, for peace, for balance, for a world that doesn't ache quite so much. And you can feel the weight of all those desires now, can't you? The Egyptian farmer who dreamed of fishing forever in a perfect river. The Polynesian navigator chasing the sunrise, not to conquer, but to return. The medieval monk who etched Eden into the edge of a parchment map, just in case. The tired Victorian tourist, sipping imported tea, pretending paradise was under his feet. None of them agreed on where paradise was, but all of them agreed on what it meant. Not perfection, not power, but relief. A space where the world paused, where hunger, fear, and loneliness stopped knocking. And that space, dear listener, was never really about the coordinates. It was about the feeling, the hush, the exhale, the finally. Scientists still argue about the origins of paradise myths. Theologists still debate whether it's heaven or metaphor. Cartographers stopped trying to plot it long ago. But the dream is still walking beside us, sometimes behind us, whispering, sometimes ahead, just out of reach, sometimes within. You stand there a little longer, letting the wind carry everything away. The failed maps, the flaming swords, the floating islands, the bureaucratic gates. What's left is quiet, the kind that feels like a blanket around your soul. Maybe we'll never find paradise the way our ancestors hoped, but maybe that was never the point. Maybe paradise isn't a place to arrive at. It's the act of reaching. And as long as we keep reaching, we're already halfway there. So now, as the sky deepens and the last trace of sunlight disappears from the sea, let's not chase anything for a while. Let's just rest. You've traveled far tonight, across myth, memory, imagination, and time. From frozen kingdoms to riverbeds long dried, from ancient maps to jungles that sing in the dark, you've followed hopes etched in stone and rumors carried on the wind. And through it all, one thing became clear. Paradise isn't a single story. It's 1,000 quiet wishes we carry, tucked into the soft folds of our thoughts. Let them settle now. Let the waves smooth over the edges of the day. Let the rivers carry your worries out to sea one by one. And if a part of you still wonders where paradise really is, that's okay. You don't need an answer tonight. You just need stillness. So breathe slower. Let your limbs sink. Let your jaw unclench. Let the world spin quietly without you for a while. You've earned that. Somewhere, the stars are rising over an ocean that doesn't need to be crossed. Somewhere, an old river still flows gently into a garden, even if no one sees it. And somewhere deep inside you, a small voice says, "You're already there." Sleep well, traveler.